He came to the mountains to outrun memories, but memories had longer legs than any man. Caleb Thorne had learned that truth in the bone-aching chill of a dozen false dawns, in places where the names on the map were just suggestions. The land he had inherited, a ragged patch of forgotten acreage in a valley cupped between the stony palms of the Appalachians, was meant to be his final retreat, a place where the silence was so profound it might finally deafen the echoes in his head. The memories were not ghosts. Ghosts were wisps of smoke. These were solid things, heavy as the Eberly-stock half-track pack he shouldered, real as the worn leather of his boots crunching on the gravel drive. They were memories of dust and sun, of a choice made in a fraction of a second that had unspooled into years of regret. He was a man in his 40s, but he felt older, aged not by time, but by the weight of a single, operational failure. His body was still the lean, efficient machine the Navy had forged, moving with a quiet economy that seemed to absorb sound. But inside, something was broken. A gear had stripped. A spring had lost its tension. This place, with its whispering pines and its sky the color of faded denim, was supposed to be the workshop where he might, or might not, attempt a repair. He stood before the old farmhouse, a structure that was surrendering to gravity with a kind of weary grace. Paint peeled like sunburnt skin from the clapboard siding. The porch sagged in a tired sigh. It was perfect. It asked nothing of him. It was as broken as he felt. Beside him, his partner stood with the stoic patience of a professional. Dutch was a German shepherd, a veteran himself, with a muzzle gone to gray and eyes that held the deep, knowing intelligence of an old soldier. He was not a pet. He was a colleague, the last remnant of a life Caleb had tried to box up and bury. Dutch's presence was a constant grounding pressure, a silent conversation that had been running between them for nearly a decade. The dog's tail gave a single perfunctory wag, not of joy, but of acknowledgement. Territory acquired, perimeter established. He looked up at Caleb, his head cocked, as if to ask, "This is it? This is the place we've come to stand down?" Caleb reached down, not to pat, but to place his hand on the solid warmth of the dog's neck, a gesture of mutual respect. The air was different here. It was clean but heavy, laden with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, resinous tang of pine. It was a living silence, not the dead vacuum of a soundproofed room. Here, the silence was made of 1,000 tiny noises, the rustle of a shrew in the undergrowth, the distant caw of a crow, the sigh of wind moving through the high branches. For the first few days, this was enough. Caleb established a routine, a discipline that was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. He rose before the sun, his internal clock still set to a harsher rhythm. Coffee, black and bitter. A perimeter walk of the property, Dutch trotting at a perfect heel, his senses questing, cataloging every scent and sound. They moved together like two parts of a single organism, a man and his shadow, both watchful, both waiting. Caleb wore the same uniform he always had, a faded olive field jacket over a plaid flannel shirt, rugged cargo pants, and the boots that had carried him across 3 continents. On his wrist, a military-issue watch, its face scratched, its ticking a quiet metronome counting out a life he was trying to forget. He was not hiding. He was waiting. He just didn't know for what. The property was larger than he had imagined, rolling back from the house into a dense thicket of woods that climbed the steep flank of the mountain. At the edge of the overgrown yard stood the skeletal remains of a great barn. Its roof had collapsed inward, a cathedral brought to its knees. The massive central beam had splintered, and the walls bowed out, held together by little more than stubbornness and memory. It was a dangerous, ruined place, and Caleb made a mental note to steer clear of it. but Dutch seemed drawn to it. During their morning patrols, the dog would slow as they approached the wreckage, his ears swiveling, his nose twitching, tasting something on the wind that was lost to Caleb. He would pause, one paw lifted, his body a rigid line of inquiry pointed directly at the decaying structure. Caleb would give a low whistle, and Dutch would obey, falling back into step, but his head would remain turned, his gaze fixed on the barn. Caleb trusted the dog's instincts more than he trusted his own. Dutch had been bred and trained to detect the anomalous, the thing that was out of place. He was an early warning system forged in the crucible of war, and his instincts were never wrong. Something about the barn was not right. The quiet of the valley floor seemed to thin around it, to hold its breath. He came to the mountains to outrun memories that whispered of failure in the heat and dust of a foreign land. He sought a silence deep enough to drown the echoes of a promise he had broken. But his canine, a veteran as weathered and haunted as himself, had other plans. On a quiet morning, the dog froze, refusing to leave the ruin of a collapsed barn. He sensed something was wrong, something buried beneath the rot and decay. He would not yield. For beneath the hay and splintered timber lay a secret, a sealed hatch that would force the man to choose between the peaceful oblivion he craved and the costly redemption he never knew he needed. What is the weight of a forgotten promise? And what does it take to finally make it right? The fourth morning, the air was sharp with the coming of autumn, and a low mist clung to the valley floor. Caleb went through his ritual, the coffee, the check of his gear, the quiet moment on the porch, watching the world wake up. But today, Dutch was different. There was no quiet assessment. There was an edge to him, a low thrum of energy that Caleb could feel through the floorboards. When Caleb stood, the dog didn't wait for the command. He moved with a purpose that was absolute, trotting directly toward the collapsed barn, his tail straight and low. "Dutch, heel," Caleb commanded, his voice calm but firm. The dog didn't even break stride. This was not disobedience. This was a declaration. Caleb's own training kicked in. When your partner acts with that kind of certainty, you don't question. You follow. He grabbed a heavy work light and a small entrenching tool from his truck, the familiar weight of the steel in his hand a small comfort. He followed Dutch into the shadow of the ruin. The air inside the barn was thick and cloying, smelling of mold, wet hay, and the ghosts of livestock long gone. Sunlight streamed through the holes in the roof in dusty, cathedral-like shafts. The place was a chaotic maze of fallen beams, splintered planks, and decades of accumulated detritus. Dutch navigated it with an unnerving precision, moving to the very center of the collapse where the main roof had caved in, creating a deep pit of debris. He stopped, his body rigid, his nose pointed at a specific spot in the muck. He looked back at Caleb, a single, sharp bark cutting the silence. It was not a request. It was an order. Then he began to dig. His paws moved with a frantic, controlled energy, flinging aside clumps of rotten hay and dark, loamy earth. Caleb watched for a moment, his senses on high alert. The dog was not just digging randomly. He was focused on a space no bigger than a dinner plate. This was different. This was not an animal chasing a scent. This was an operator indicating a target. Caleb set down the light and began to work alongside the dog. He used the entrenching tool, methodically clearing away the layers of decay. The work was slow and arduous. The hay was waterlogged and heavy, tangled with rusted barbed wire and broken pieces of farm equipment. Dutch never stopped, pausing only to whine with impatience when Caleb had to move a particularly large piece of timber. An hour passed, then 2. Sweat soaked the collar of Caleb's flannel shirt. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist. His muscles, accustomed to this kind of labor, fell into a steady rhythm. Dig, lift, clear, repeat. He was no longer thinking about the past or the future. He was only in this moment, in this task, guided by the unwavering certainty of his partner. Then the shovel struck something that was not wood, not earth, not stone. It made a dull, metallic clank. He stopped. The sound had a resonance, a finality that cut through the quiet labor. He knelt down, pushing the debris away with his hands. Dutch whined, a high, keen sound of anticipation, and pushed his nose into the hole Caleb was clearing. Caleb felt it first with his gloved fingers. Cold, smooth, unyielding metal. He worked faster now, his breath held tight in his chest. He cleared a wider area, scraping away the last of the muck. It was a pipe. A metal pipe, about 4 inches in diameter, capped with a grated cowl. A vent. An air vent, deliberately placed, leading down into the earth. His blood ran cold. A root cellar might have a vent, but not like this. This was professionally made, precisely engineered. He followed the line of the vent with his hands, digging sideways. His fingers brushed against a new surface, a flat plane of steel, pitted with rust but undeniably solid. He kept clearing, his heart hammering against his ribs. He uncovered a corner, then an edge, then a thick, recessed handle. It was a hatch, a heavy steel hatch, set flush into what must have been a concrete slab beneath the barn's original floor. It was roughly 4 feet square, its surface coated in grime and rust. It looked military. The recessed, wheel-like handle in the center was a design he recognized, built to be dogged down tight, to withstand pressure, to keep what was inside in, and what was outside out. This was no farm cellar. This was a bunker, a tomb, a secret buried beneath a secret. Dutch sat back on his haunches, his work done. He panted quietly, his gaze fixed on the hatch, then up at Caleb. The question was plain in his intelligent eyes. Now what? Caleb stared at the steel door in the earth. The peaceful silence he had come here to find had just been shattered. The mountain was no longer a refuge. It was a mystery. And he knew, with a sinking feeling that was part dread and part a long dormant sense of purpose, that he was going to have to open it. The past he had tried to bury had a way of finding him, even here. Or perhaps he had been led to it all along. He spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened awareness, the kind he hadn't felt since his last deployment. Every sense was sharp, honed to a fine edge. The world had come into a stark, sudden focus. He secured the site, dragging heavier timbers over the hatch, not to hide it, but to make it more difficult for anyone to stumble upon. He was marking his territory, claiming the problem as his own. He knew he couldn't force the hatch open with the tools he had. The wheel was frozen with rust, and the seams were sealed tight by decades of neglect. He needed leverage, penetrating oil, and more information. The quiet valley no longer felt empty. It felt watched. He found himself scanning the tree line, his eyes tracing the ridges that overlooked his property. The feeling was illogical, a phantom limb of old training, but it was there. The weight of the discovery settled on him, a responsibility he had not asked for, but could not ignore. Dutch stayed close, a silent, furry sentinel, his presence a constant reminder of the anomaly they had unearthed. The next morning, Caleb drove his beat-up Ford truck into the small town nestled in the crook of the valley. The town was called Harmony, a name that felt like a bitter joke. It was a place that time seemed to have largely forgotten, with a single main street lined with brick buildings from another century. A hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a county courthouse that stood like a proud, aging matriarch. He felt alien here, his quiet intensity and the disciplined set of his shoulders marking him as an outsider. People watched him from behind shop windows, their gazes curious but not unkind. He was a new piece in a very old puzzle, and they were trying to see where he fit. He went to the hardware store first, buying a 3-foot breaker bar, a can of industrial-grade rust penetrant, and a heavy-duty chain. The man behind the counter was old, his hands gnarled but strong. He looked at the items, then at Caleb. "Got a stubborn project?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Something like that," Caleb replied. The man nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "This valley's full of 'em. Stubborn roots, stubborn rocks, stubborn memories." Caleb's next stop was the courthouse. It was cool and quiet inside, smelling of floor wax and old paper. The silence here was different from the silence of the woods. It was a curated, bureaucratic quiet. He found the county clerk's office, a room lined with massive leather-bound ledgers and filing cabinets. A woman sat behind a large oak desk, her posture ramrod straight. She was in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. A small engraved plaque on her desk read, "Eleanor Vance, County Clerk." She was the female authority figure from the archetype, the gatekeeper of the valley's official history. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral, appraising. "Can I help you?" Her voice was crisp, no nonsense. "I'd like to see the original surveys and property deeds for the old Miller farm," Caleb said, his own voice quiet, respectful. "The one at the end of Ridge Road." "I own it now," he added, preempting her next question. She raised an eyebrow. "You're the Thorne boy. From California, they said." News traveled fast. "Just Thorne," he corrected gently. "And yes." Eleanor Vance studied him for a long moment. He saw in her gaze the shrewd assessment of a woman who had seen everything this valley had to offer, the good, the bad, and the hidden. She saw the military bearing he couldn't hide, the watch on his wrist, the stillness in his hands. He wasn't some developer or a weekend tourist. She seemed to come to a decision. She stood, her movements precise, and walked to a large, flat file cabinet in the corner. "The Miller place has a complicated history," she said, her back to him as she pulled out a heavy drawer. "Most of the old families do." She retrieved a long, rolled-up tube of brittle paper and a dusty ledger. She spread the survey map across a wide table. It was a beautiful, hand-drawn document from the 1930s. The lines faded, the paper yellowed to the color of old ivory. "That's the original parcel," she said, tapping a section with her finger. "But in the 50s, the government exercised an eminent domain claim on a small section. Right here." She pointed to a corner of his property, a corner that encompassed the old barn. "Said it was for a weather station. Never made much sense. We get our weather from the station over on Blue Mountain." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "They held the lease for 50 years. It expired a decade ago. The land reverted back, but whatever they built, they just left it." While Caleb was examining the map, an older man shuffled into the office. He was stooped, with a cloud of white hair and thick glasses that magnified his eyes. He carried a stack of books and wore a tweed jacket despite the mild weather. "Eleanor, have you seen the minutes from the 1958 town council meeting?" he asked, his voice reedy but full of academic passion. Eleanor gestured toward him. "Mr. Thorne, this is Arthur Finch. He's our local historian, retired professor from the State University. Arthur, this is the new owner of the Miller place." Arthur's eyes lit up behind his thick lenses. "The Miller place? Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Did you know that during the height of the Cold War, this entire valley was a hotbed of, well, we don't know exactly what, but there were rumors. Unmarked trucks on the roads at night, men in suits asking quiet questions.
The official story was atmospheric research, but I've always believed it was a listening post, part of the old early warning network, pointed east. Arthur Finch, the expert, had just given Caleb a critical piece of the puzzle. A listening post.
It fit the military-grade hatch, the isolated location, the secrecy. "Did they ever find anything?" Caleb asked, keeping his tone casual. Arthur sighed, a puff of dusty disappointment. "No. When the government packed up, they were thorough. Nothing left but stories. And a few stubborn old coots who swear they still hear ghosts in the static on their radios." Armed with new tools and a working theory, Caleb returned to the farm. The afternoon sun was warm on his back as he knelt beside the hatch. He soaked the rusted wheel mechanism with the penetrating oil, letting it seep into the frozen gears. Then he fitted the breaker bar over one of the spokes of the wheel and began to push. For a long time, nothing happened. The rust held its ground, a silent, stubborn sentinel. Caleb repositioned himself, setting his feet, using his whole body, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching. He applied slow, steady pressure, the kind of patience learned in situations where brute force was not the answer, but sustained, relentless effort was. There was a groan, a high-pitched screech of metal on metal that sounded like a scream. Then, with a sudden, violent crack, the seal broke. The wheel moved, just an inch. It was enough. He worked it back and forth, the movement growing easier with each turn. Finally, the locking dogs disengaged with a series of heavy clunks. The hatch was unlocked. He put his hands on the recessed handle and lifted. The hatch was incredibly heavy, a solid slab of steel and concrete, but it rose on well-oiled countersprings, opening with a soft hiss of displaced air. A wave of cold, stale air washed over him, smelling of ozone, dust, and time itself. A steep metal ladder descended into the darkness. Caleb shone his work light down into the void. The beam cut through the black, revealing a small, square room, no more than 10 feet by 10 feet. It was lined with concrete, stark and utilitarian. Against the far wall stood a simple metal desk and a chair. Nothing else. It was a cell, a concrete box buried in the earth. Dutch whined at the edge of the opening, peering down, his ears flat against his head. He did not like this place. "Stay," Caleb commanded softly, and the dog sat, his eyes never leaving the black square. Caleb clipped the light to his belt, checked that his folding knife was secure in his pocket, and began to descend the ladder. The cold intensified as he went down, a damp, subterranean chill that seemed to seep into his bones. His boots clanged on the metal rungs, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. He reached the bottom and stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, his senses taking in every detail. The air was dead, without any current or life. The silence was absolute, a crushing weight. This place had been sealed for a very long time. On the desk sat a single object. A large, olive-drab steel footlocker, the kind he had seen 1,000 times in his career. It was closed but not locked. He approached it cautiously, his training overriding his curiosity. He ran his hands along the seams, checking for wires or booby traps. It was clean. He lifted the latches, the metallic snap echoing in the tiny room. He braced himself, not knowing what he would find. Weapons? Money? Classified documents? He lifted the lid. The contents were mundane and yet somehow shocking. There were no weapons, no gold. The footlocker was filled with dozens of reel-to-reel audio tapes, each in its own cardboard box, meticulously labeled with dates and code numbers. Beneath the tapes were stacks of logbooks, their pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. And under the logbooks were maps. Not military maps of foreign countries,
but detailed topographical maps of the valley, of Harmony. He picked up the top logbook.
The first entry was dated June 10th, 1958.
Site active. Commencing baseline audio survey. The writing was crisp, professional. He flipped through the pages. The entries detailed years of surveillance. They recorded radio traffic, telephone conversations, anything and everything that could be pulled from the airwaves. It was exactly what Arthur Finch had suspected, a Cold War listening post. But as he kept reading, the dates continued long past the fall of the Berlin Wall, long past the end of the Cold War. The entries shifted in the late 1990s. The targets of the surveillance were no longer Soviet transmissions. They were local. The logs detailed conversations between farmers, the town mayor, members of the county council. He picked up one of the maps. It was his property, but there were strange markings on it, geological surveys he didn't recognize. Another map showed the entire valley, with certain parcels of land circled in red.
Parcels that, according to the logs, belonged to families who had suffered unexplained financial hardship, sudden illnesses, wells that had gone dry. Then he saw it. A logbook from 2003. The handwriting was different, more hurried. The entries were less about surveillance and more about documentation. The writer was recording private conversations of executives from a company called Viridian Development. They were talking about land acquisition, about suppressing geological reports, about leveraging old government contracts to gain control of the valley. They were discussing mineral rights. The atmospheric research had never stopped. It had just changed its objective. They weren't listening for enemies abroad. They were prospecting, using the government's secret station for corporate espionage. It was a story of a slow, methodical, and deeply illegal theft of a valley from its people. And at the bottom of a page, in a list of personnel associated with Viridian Security Consultant, was a name. A name that made the cold air in the bunker freeze in Caleb's lungs. Lieutenant Commander Robert Morrison. A man Caleb had served with. A man who had gone dark after a disastrous operation in the Korengal Valley. An operation where Caleb had made the choice to complete the mission and a wounded partner had been left behind. The past wasn't just knocking. It had kicked the door down. He spent hours in the bunker, a man in a tomb of secrets. He emerged into the late afternoon sun, blinking, feeling as though he had surfaced from a deep dive. The world outside seemed impossibly bright, impossibly vibrant. The weight he carried now was not just his own regret, but the weight of the valley's stolen history. He sealed the hatch, leaving the breaker bar and tools hidden nearby. As he walked back to the house, Dutch fell into step beside him, pressing his body against Caleb's leg, a gesture of solidarity. The dog seemed to understand. The mission had begun. This quiet place of refuge had become a battlefield, and he was the lone soldier holding the line. He didn't know who the enemy was, not yet, but they had a name, Viridian Development, and they had a history. And now, he had their secrets. That night, sleep did not come. He sat on the porch in the dark, the logbook in his lap, Dutch's head resting on his boot. The silence of the mountains was gone, replaced by the whispering voices from the tapes, the silent screams from the pages of the logbooks. He was no longer a man in exile. He was a guardian. If this chapter stirred something in you, if the quiet courage of a man deciding to stand for something beyond himself resonates with the faith in your own heart, take a moment to support our community. The world often tells us to walk away, to seek our own peace, but sometimes God asks us to stay and listen, to be the guardian of a truth that has been forgotten. If you believe in these quiet miracles of purpose, please like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. Your engagement helps us continue to tell stories about the strength it takes to do the right thing. Subscribe to our channel so we can continue to explore the moments where ordinary people are called to extraordinary tasks. Sometimes the Lord asks us to stay and listen. 2 days later they came. Caleb was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a meditative act, when he heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. It wasn't the gravelly rumble of a local's pickup. It was the smooth, expensive purr of a luxury sedan. It was utterly out of place, a sleek black shark in a pond of trout. The car pulled to a stop at the end of his drive, and a man got out. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Caleb's truck. He was handsome, his smile easy and confident, but his eyes were cold, calculating. He moved with a languid grace that spoke of power held in reserve. This was the polite antagonist. This was the face of Viridian development. Dutch, who had been dozing in a patch of sun, rose to his feet without a sound. His body went rigid, the fur along his spine bristling almost imperceptibly. He didn't growl. He didn't need to. His stillness was more menacing than any sound. The man stopped a respectful distance away, his hands held loosely at his sides. "Mr. Thorne?" he called out, his voice pleasant, reasonable. "My name is Harmon. I'm with the Viridian Group." Caleb didn't answer. He simply planted the axe in the splitting block and stood, watching. He let the silence stretch, a tactic he'd learned long ago. The man who speaks first often reveals the most. Harmon's smile didn't falter. "I understand you're the new owner here. We just wanted to introduce ourselves. We're doing some reclamation work in the valley, under an old contract with the Department of the Interior. Environmental cleanup mostly. We'll be working on a parcel that adjoins your property." He gestured vaguely toward the mountains. It was a masterful performance of cordial bureaucracy. He was laying the groundwork for his authority, establishing a narrative of legitimacy. "Reclamation," Caleb said, his voice flat. It was the first word he'd spoken. Harmon nodded eagerly. "That's right. There was some old government equipment left behind. Contaminants. We're here to safely remove it." His eyes flickered for a fraction of a second toward the collapsed barn. It was all the confirmation Caleb needed. He knew. "The equipment in the barn," Caleb stated, not a question. Harmon's smile tightened by a millimeter. "Ah, so you found it. The old weather station. Yes, that's the primary site. We have a team coming in tomorrow to begin the excavation and removal. I'd appreciate it if you'd allow my crew access." He was framing it as a request, but it was an order wrapped in polite language. He was testing Caleb, seeing if he would be compliant, easily managed. Caleb thought of the logbooks, of the lives documented in their pages, of the slow-motion theft of a community's future. He thought of Robert Morrison's name. "This is private property," Caleb said quietly. Harmon's expression shifted. The corporate charm receded, replaced by a cool, hard patience. "The government easement is still on the books, Mr. Thorne. A legal technicality, but a binding one. We have the right to access and reclaim federal assets. That bunker and its contents are federal assets." He used the word bunker. He was done pretending. "They're not assets," Caleb said, his voice still low, but now with a core of steel. "They're records. They're testimony." Harmon sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment, as if dealing with an unreasonable child. "Mr. Thorne, you're a man with a certain background. I've read your file. You understand how these things work. Information gets decontextualized over time. Things are misinterpreted. What you have down there is a historical footnote,
and my job is to make sure it remains a footnote, not a headline that could cause a great deal of unnecessary trouble for a lot of good people." It was a veiled threat, a warning to stand down. He was appealing to Caleb's past, to the idea of a shared understanding between men who operated in the gray areas. He was trying to recruit him into the conspiracy of silence. Caleb didn't move. He just looked at Harmon, his gaze steady. He didn't need to raise his voice. He had a better weapon.
He held up the logbook he'd brought out with him that morning.
He didn't open it. He just held it. A slim volume of paper and ink against all of Harmon's power and money. Harmon's eyes locked onto the book. His face, for the first time, went utterly blank. The mask of civility fell away, revealing the cold, predatory ambition beneath. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind died down. The birds stopped singing. It was a standoff, a battle of wills played out in the quiet of the autumn afternoon. Then Dutch acted. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward, placing himself between Caleb and Harmon. He lowered his head, and a sound rumbled deep in his chest. It was not the warning growl of a guard dog. It was a low, guttural promise of controlled violence, a sound that spoke of torn flesh and broken bones. His lips curled back just enough to reveal the white gleam of his canines. The dog's judgment was absolute. This man was a threat.
Harmon, who had faced down corporate boards and hostile negotiations, took an involuntary step back. His eyes, which had been locked on Caleb, darted to the dog. He saw not a pet, but a weapon. A flicker of genuine fear crossed his face before he masked it again with a veneer of annoyance. "Control your animal, Thorn," he said, his voice tight. "He is controlled," Caleb replied softly. The message was clear. The dog was not acting on its own. It was an extension of Caleb's will. Harmon straightened his suit jacket, a gesture of reasserting his composure. "This is a mistake," he said, his voice once again smooth, but with an edge of venom. "You're involving yourself in something you don't understand. I'm offering you a simple, clean way out. Forget what you've seen. Let us do our work. In a week, we'll be gone, and you'll have your peace and quiet." He was offering a return to the very thing Caleb had come here for, a return to the silence. But the silence was no longer peaceful. It was complicit. "I understand enough," Caleb said. Harmon held his gaze for another long moment, then gave a curt nod. It was a dismissal. He turned without another word, got back into his sleek black car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air. Caleb watched until the car disappeared. The confrontation was over, but the war had just been declared. He reached down and rested his hand on Dutch's head. The dog's muscles were still coiled tight, the low growl still vibrating in his chest. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured. "It's just getting started." The quiet valley was now a chessboard, and the first move had been made. The storm came the next day, as if summoned by the conflict. The sky, which had been a clear, brilliant blue, began to bruise in the late afternoon, turning a sickly shade of purple and gray. The wind picked up, moaning through the pines, a low, mournful sound. It carried the smell of rain and ozone. Caleb had spent the day preparing. He had called Eleanor Vance, the county clerk. He didn't tell her everything, just that a corporation was trying to force its way onto his land to access the old government site. He asked her to look into the legality of the easement Harmon had mentioned. She had been silent for a moment, then said, "I'll see what I can find. Be careful, Mr. Thorne." He also made another call, to a number he hadn't dialed in years. A former teammate, now a lawyer. He left a cryptic message, a series of code words and a location, an insurance policy in case things went sideways.
He moved the most critical logbooks and tapes from the bunker to a hidden cache in the woods, a place he had scouted for just such a purpose. He was working on instinct now, the muscle memory of 100 covert operations taking over. Just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, they returned. It wasn't just Harmon's sedan this time.
A heavy-duty flatbed truck, carrying a small crew of 4 men and a generator, rumbled up the drive. Harmon got out of his car, no longer in a suit. He wore expensive outdoor gear that looked like it had never seen a speck of mud. He was flanked by his crew, rough-looking men with the hard, impassive faces of hired muscle. One man, however, stood slightly apart. He was younger than the others, with a military haircut and a way of standing, at ease but alert, that Caleb recognized instantly. He was a veteran. Their eyes met for a brief second across the rain-swept yard, a flicker of acknowledgement between 2 men who had lived by a similar code, even if they now stood on opposite sides of a line. This was the conflicted insider. Caleb saw the unease in his eyes. Harmon gestured to the barn. "We're not asking this time, Thorne," he shouted over the rising wind. "Stand aside." Caleb stood his ground in front of the collapsed barn, Dutch a silent shadow at his side. The rain was coming down harder now, plastering his hair to his forehead and soaking his jacket. "You're not touching it," he said, his voice lost in the wind, but his stance unequivocal. Harmon laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You can't stop us." He nodded to his men, who started unloading equipment, including a heavy oxyacetylene cutting torch. They were going to cut the hatch open. The scene devolved into a kind of chaotic, slow-motion battle. The wind howled, tearing at the rotten structure of the barn. Caleb moved to block the path of the men carrying the torch, placing his body in their way. He wasn't armed, not in the traditional sense, but his entire being was a weapon of defiance. He was a rock in the stream of their aggression. Then, the storm unleashed its fury. A massive gust of wind, a physical blow, slammed into the barn. There was a terrible, groaning crack of ancient timber. A huge section of the remaining roof, a lattice of beams and planks weighing hundreds of pounds, tore loose. It seemed to hang in the air for a terrible second before it crashed down, right where Caleb and Dutch were standing. Caleb reacted instantly, throwing himself backward, but Dutch, ever the protector, had moved forward, barking, trying to drive the men back. The collapsing roof section caught him. A heavy, splintered beam landed across the dog's hindquarters, pinning his leg to the ground. Dutch let out a sharp, piercing yelp of pain that cut through the roar of the storm. The sound struck Caleb like a physical blow, colder and sharper than the rain. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes locked on his partner. Dutch was trapped, whining in pain, trying to pull his leg free from under the immense weight. And in that moment, the world dissolved. The rain, the barn, Harmon, it all faded away, replaced by the choking dust and searing sun of the Korengal Valley. He was back there, in the firefight. The sound of AK-47s, the scream of a wounded teammate, the voice of his commander in his ear. "We have to move, Lieutenant! Now! Leave him!" He had made the choice. He had followed the order. He had completed the mission. And he had left a man behind. The memory was a hot brand on his soul. He looked up and saw Harmon watching him, a smirk of triumph on his face. "Tough break," Harmon yelled over the wind. "Leave the dog. You can't save him and stop us." The choice. It was the same choice, dressed in a different uniform. Abandon his partner to protect the mission, to guard the secret in the hatch. Or stay. Stay and choose loyalty. Choose the one life he was responsible for, right here, right now. The past and the present converged, a terrible, beautiful,
clarifying moment of decision. Without a second of hesitation, Caleb turned his back on Harmon. He turned his back on the hatch, on the secrets, on the mission. He went to his dog.
He knelt in the mud in the rain, his hands running over the heavy beam, assessing the situation. Dutch licked his hand, his eyes filled with pain but also with unwavering trust. "I'm here, boy," Caleb whispered, his voice thick. "I'm not leaving you." He looked around frantically, his mind trained for improvisation, searching for a tool, a lever. He saw a long, solid piece of timber, a fallen stud from the barn wall. It would have to do. He jammed one end of the timber under the heavy beam that pinned Dutch's leg and began to push down on the other end, using a smaller block of wood as a fulcrum. His muscles screamed in protest. The beam was immense, waterlogged and heavy as stone. He put his entire body into it, his feet slipping in the mud, the rain blurring his vision. He grunted with the effort, a raw, animal sound of pure will. He was no longer a soldier. He was just a man trying to save his friend. The beam lifted. An inch, then 2. It was enough. "Go, Dutch, go!" he yelled. The dog, with a painful scramble, pulled his leg free and dragged himself away from the wreckage. Just as Dutch got clear, Caleb's strength gave out. The lever slipped and the massive beam crashed back to the ground. Caleb fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his body shaking with adrenaline and exertion. He had done it. He had made the other choice. He had stayed. A profound sense of peace, of release washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He had failed the mission. He had lost the hatch. But he had saved his soul. As he knelt there in the mud, the sound of another vehicle cut through the storm. A sheriff's department SUV, its lights flashing, slid to a halt, spraying mud. Eleanor Vance got out of the passenger side, holding a sheaf of papers protected by a plastic sleeve. The sheriff, a large, grim-faced man, got out of the driver's side, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Harmon!" Eleanor's voice was a whip crack. "You and your men are in violation of a court-ordered injunction. You are to cease all activity and vacate this property immediately." Harmon stared at her, then at the sheriff, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His plan had unraveled, and as Caleb looked past them, he saw the young veteran on Harmon's crew. The man was looking at Caleb, at the exhausted, mud-covered man and the injured dog at his side. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was him, the conflicted insider. He had seen Caleb's choice, the moment he turned his back on the fight to save his partner. He had recognized the code of loyalty that transcended any contract or paycheck. He had made the call. The tide had turned, not because of a fight, but because of a small, decent act, born from a moment of profound moral courage. The secret was safe. The morning after was preternaturally calm. The storm had scrubbed the air clean, and the world seemed newborn, glistening under a gentle sun. The chaotic wreckage of the barn was now a protected scene, cordoned off with yellow tape. The sheriff's SUV was parked quietly near the house, a symbol of a new, lawful order. Harmon and his crew were gone, escorted out of the valley the night before, their cutting torches and bluster rendered impotent by a single sheet of paper and a man's choice. Eleanor Vance stood with Arthur Finch near the open hatch, the old historian almost vibrating with a kind of reverent excitement. He held one of the reel-to-reel tapes in his hands as if it were a holy relic. "This is it, Eleanor," he was saying, his voice hushed. "This is the proof. Decades of it. It's more than I ever imagined." Eleanor looked over at Caleb, who was sitting on the top step of his porch. She gave him a slow, respectful nod. They were allies now, partners in the unearthing of a truth. Caleb was carefully cleaning the wound on Dutch's leg. It was a nasty gash, but the limb wasn't broken. He had stitched it closed the night before with a suture kit from his old medic bag, his hands steady, his focus absolute. Dutch endured the treatment with a quiet stoicism, occasionally licking Caleb's hand as if to say, "It's all right. We're all right." The heavy weight that had settled in Caleb's chest years ago in the dust of Afghanistan felt lighter. It was still there, a scar that would never fully fade, but it no longer had the crushing density of active regret. It was becoming the quiet weight of memory, a part of his history, not the entirety of his present. As he was tying off a fresh bandage, he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel. It wasn't the sheriff. It was a small, unfamiliar rental car. A woman got out. She was slim, with dark hair like his, and eyes that held a familiar sadness. It was his sister, Sarah. He hadn't seen her in 3 years. She walked toward him slowly, her gaze taking in the scene, the battered barn, the police tape. Him. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. They just looked at each other for a long moment, the silence between them filled with years of unspoken arguments, of his retreat from the family, from the world. He had pushed her away, along with everyone else, convinced his own brokenness was contagious. "I got a call," she said finally, her voice a little shaky. "From one of your old friends. A lawyer. He said you might be in some trouble. He said you might need someone." The insurance policy. He had called for legal help, and his friend had sent him family. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" felt too small. "Thank you" felt too weak. So he said nothing. He just looked at her, letting her see him. Really see him. For the first time in a long time. The guarded walls he had built around himself had been breached. She looked from his face down to the dog, to the careful way he was tending to the bandage. "He told me you made a choice," she said softly. "He said you stayed." She didn't need to elaborate. Caleb knew what she meant. It wasn't about the dog, not really. It was about the choice he didn't make all those years ago. The choice that had sent him into this long exile. He finished with the bandage and slowly nodded, meeting her gaze. "I stayed," he confirmed. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but she was smiling. It was a fragile, hopeful thing. It was a beginning. Later that day, he stood in front of the small mirror in the bathroom, his face still streaked with mud. For years, he had avoided his own reflection, unable to meet the eyes of the man who had followed orders and left a friend behind. But now, he looked. He saw the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the gray at his temples. But he also saw something else, something that had been missing. A quiet resolve. A measure of peace. He had not won a battle. He had simply passed a test. He had not run. He had not fought. He had stayed. And in staying, he had found his way back. The story of the Harmony listening post and the corporate malfeasance it had secretly recorded became a quiet local legend, then a matter of state record. The tapes and logbooks, championed by Arthur Finch and protected by Eleanor Vance, were entered into evidence in a series of legal actions that would, slowly but surely, return control of the valley's future to its people. Viridian's contracts were nullified, and Harmon disappeared into the labyrinth of corporate litigation. The land around the barn was designated a protected historical site by the county. The hatch remained, a quiet monument to a secret that had refused to stay buried. Caleb didn't leave. The silence he had sought was no longer the silence of escape, but the silence of belonging. He accepted Eleanor's offer to help train a new volunteer search and rescue team for the county. His skills, honed for war, could be repurposed for healing, for finding the lost and bringing them home. His mission had changed. He was no longer a soldier in retreat, but a guardian of his chosen home. A month later, in the crisp, golden light of late autumn, Caleb and Dutch walked a high ridge overlooking the valley. Dutch moved with only a slight limp, a physical reminder of the choice that had changed everything. Below them, the town of Harmony was a miniature of peaceful order, the tendrils of smoke from chimneys rising straight into the still air. Caleb stopped and looked out at the vast expanse of mountains, their peaks fading into a blue haze. The weight on his shoulders was still there. It would always be there. But it was different now. It was the ballast that kept him steady, not the anchor that held him down. He reached down and laid his hand on Dutch's neck, feeling the steady, living warmth. The dog leaned against him, a silent affirmation. They stood there for a long time, man and dog, two old soldiers who had finally found their peace, not in the forgetting of the past, but in the quiet, deliberate act of building a future. The earned peace was not an absence of scars, but the acceptance of them. It was the quiet knowledge that when the test came, he had not been found wanting. He had stayed. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a man and his dog, or a secret buried in the earth. It is a testament to the quiet miracles that God places in our path when we feel most lost. He came to the mountains seeking an end, a final silence to his pain. But the Lord, in his infinite wisdom, gave him a beginning instead. He sent a faithful companion not to help him forget, but to force him to remember what truly matters: loyalty, integrity, and the courage to face the ghosts of our past. The hatch was not a door to a treasure, but a gateway to a second chance. It was a call to service, a reminder that our deepest wounds can become the source of our greatest strength. If you are watching this while carrying the weight of a past silence, a choice you regret, know that redemption is not always a grand, dramatic event. Sometimes it is a quiet decision to stay when everything tells you to run. It is the choice to tend to a wound, to honor a partner, to speak a truth that has been buried. It is in these small, faithful acts that God does his greatest work. May you find the strength to face your own collapsed barns, and may you have the courage to open the hatches in your own life. May you find a loyal friend to stand by your side, and may you, too, find the peace that comes not from escaping, but from staying. God bless you and keep you. Thank you for walking this path with us. If this story touched your heart, please share it, so that its message of hope and second chances can find those who need to hear it most. Comment below with a time you chose to stay, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and quiet redemption.